Okay, let's let's come together just in the spirit of prayer, and then we'll begin our presentation. I'll begin the presentation, and trust it's one that you will enjoy. Let's pray together. It is a significant day for us in this country, O God. We are, for the most part, proud to be a part of this country and its heritage. There are moments that are really embarrassing and difficult, and moments we would love to apologize for. But we thank you for the most important piece, the freedoms that we enjoy, the freedoms that you provide through this country, and the freedom you give us within through Jesus the Christ. Receive our gift of praise and thanksgiving today for all of these blessings, and bless these moments we spend just looking at an important piece of history. In the name of Jesus, the one who does provide us our liberation. In Christ's name, amen. All righty, today we tackle the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, much of this presentation, as you can see, is based on a presentation that I purchased some years ago, but I certainly want to give credit to. It has to do with the Rose Publishing Company, and it is a series, but I've updated it a great deal and modified it a great deal because, as you can see, this was done in 2006, and so there is much information that is new and available to us. But I did want to give them credit for much of what you see. When you see these kinds of slides, it's that this basically is their stuff, though again, I've modified the details. So we're talking today about ancient documents that have been discovered in 1946 and 1947, actually through about 1956, and as you will see today, as recently as March of this year. More discoveries. Initially, we were talking just about one community, the Qumran community, which is 13 miles east of Jerusalem, as you can see, and some 1,300 feet below sea level. This is a very dry and arid portion. I'm going to show you a map in just a little bit. This portion of East Israel is very desert-like and very arid for some of you who have been there, like Paul and Shannon, and others of you who may have made visits to Israel as well along the way. You would know this. These materials were found in caves that were located along this dry riverbed, which is called a wadi, the Wadi Qumran. And so that's the name of the community. It picks up from this riverbed. And there are 5 other locations now that we know about where other Dead Sea Scrolls are, again, because they're along the Dead Sea, scrolls that are related to the Bible or biblical information or that context, that time frame. And so we'll talk a little bit about those as well, and I'll show you where those are. So the main one we're talking about is the Qumran community, which is located, as you can see by this map, again, 13 miles east of Jerusalem and a little bit south. It's not quite directly east. But then there are 5 other areas. So I have circled Qumran just to show you that area, how far north it is, but these other 5 are located south of there. And in 1953, several discoveries started in various caves. The 12 minor prophets, or as it is often called, the Book of the 12. Again, when you're talking about the Tanakh, they're grouped into one book. For us, they appear as Joel, as Amos, Hosea, so forth. Minor only in the sense of size, not importance. They are just as important as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth, but that's how we refer to them through the years. There was another piece found that just pieces of Genesis, and you can see the textual references here at the Wadi Sadir. But the most important finds have come recently. There were some in 1953 at this particular location, as you can see on the map. There are two caves there. One is called the Cave of Letters because they found some letters there in the 1950s, 1953 or so. And then they found this other cave called the Cave of Horrors. And now that's the name they gave it as a result of what they found there. Okay, most of you are familiar with the Jewish revolt that took place in 66 CE and lasted until about 72 CE, 73, which actually ended, the major piece of that was the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Now, most of us are at least a little bit familiar with that Jewish revolt, and of course the Roman conquest, and put that revolt down. But we're not familiar very much with another revolt that happened about 60 years later, 132 to 136 CE. Again, this would be about 100 years after Jesus, okay, so later than that. So during this revolt, it was named after a man named Bar Kokhba, Kokhbah, Kokhba. He was the one who led the revolt, or started the revolution, if you wish, against the Roman authorities again. And this too was squelched. And one of the places that the people retreated were to these caves at this particular location at Hever. And so they hid in those caves. Well, the Romans came along and built a camp on top and laid siege to the caves, and some of the people just simply died there. They never did escape or get out of the caves. And so they found in 1953, those who were excavating the site found some 40 remains, human remains, men, women, and children. And so that's why it was given the name the Cave of Horrors. Now, in March of this year, news release, the findings have been going on for the last couple of years. Remember the basket that I showed you earlier in one of the presentations that had been found in the desert, the oldest woven basket known to exist? They found it in this Cave of Horrors in the desert, and it dates back to about 10,500 BCE. So during the Chalcolithic period of time. Then they also found a child's mummified body just recently, in the last year or two. They lifted a stone, a rock, a slab, and underneath it was a child's body, somewhere between 8 and 12 years old probably, that was in a fetal position and had been wrapped in cloth and laid there, and that body dates back to about 6,000 BCE. And then they found about 80 different fragments in the last couple of years that are related to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They contain parts of Zedekiah and Nahum, two of the biblical prophets that we read about in the First Testament. So this has been an important discovery. And again, they found a Greek copy of the 12 minor prophets in this location, and these other pieces were in Greek as well. Then there have been phylacteries that have been found in various locations, but specifically in this one. And when we get to Masada, we are talking about several fragments that were found in a synagogue, in the remains of a synagogue at this location. So all along the Dead Sea, they're still in the process of looking, of exploring, of trying to find new discoveries, and they are. As you know, they also found this jawbone on the western side that we talked about earlier that dates well back into the Chalcolithic period, showing the remains of humanity there. 107, not Chalcolithic, but Paleolithic, 174 to 194, something like that BCE. So the discoveries are happening quickly these days. And they are important to us because they affirm a lot of the material we have in the Bible, but they also tell us about the context and the history, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is a view, well, for some reason, let me go back. For some reason, I can't, oh, you can see it. I can't see it at the back of the light. Hopefully you can see it. No, you can't. I'm sorry, yellow doesn't show up on your, like it does on my computer. All right, this is the community, the Qumran community that I'm showing you here, and you can see the Dead Sea beyond, so you can see how close this is to the Dead Sea, and I'm going to show you an aerial view of the community. This would be looking from the west. And you can see the wadi there to the right. It looks like it has water in it, so this must have been during the rainy season when this was taken, but most of the time it's a dry bed, a dry river bed. And here is one of the caves. This is Cave 4, and this is where a lot of the material has been found for the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'll show you that. You can see... Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, even the white is not showing up. I'm sorry. They were showing up quite well in my computer, but why they are not showing up through the projector, I don't know. But you can see Cave 4B is right here, and Cave 4A is right here, and that's the one I showed you the picture of just a moment ago. And there are several of them located together there. There are 11 caves. And this material is called marl just simply because it's just layers of limestone. Some specifics about these finds: a collection of documents, obviously, that has been discovered. There are, as you will see, about 100,000 all total from 1947. Now we can say to 2021, but most of them were found before 1956. I'm going to tell you the story in just a moment. Most of you have heard it before, so maybe it'll just be a bit of a refresher. They contain the oldest copies of the Old Testament. Prior to these discoveries, remember most of the 25,000 copies of manuscripts that we have of pieces that are in our Bible date mostly to around the 10th century CE, to only about 1,000 years ago. Now, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls and discoveries, we have documents that are now 2,000 years old and pretty close to the context, and certainly the context of Jesus. Though probably after most of the material in the First Testament. Probably produced between 250 and 68 or 70 CE when the Second Temple was destroyed, but these folks were probably in hiding from the Roman authorities or had gone off to develop this isolated monastic community. And primarily they were made up of scribes and copyists and people who just wanted to belong to the community in something of a monastic lifestyle. Most of the material is composed in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. There are a few pieces that are exceptions. Most of them, or at least many of them, are kept in the Shrine of the Book in Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The Shrine of the Book is a section of that museum where they are kept, except they are not kept out in open display. There are reproductions out in open display. I'll show you how they're preserving them today. According to one source, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are close to 100,000 fragments written on parchment for the most part. Some on animal skins, papyrus, and there's even one document that was found written on a copper roll. And I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. The material is written from right to left, which is traditional for Hebrew, right? You start our Bible from the left side, the top of the left page, the top of the first page anyway, and on the left-hand side, it's just the reverse for the Hebrew Bible. You start what would be the back. This would be where you would start, and you would start reading right to left. So this is very much, and they were without punctuation, and some of them even lacked spaces between words, which makes translating them even more difficult. And again, the ancient Hebrew, you are looking at words without vowels. You don't have vowels in Hebrew again until the 10th century with the Masoretes. That scribal group are the ones who made vowel appointments for the Hebrew text. The ink was carbon-based, which simply means it is thermally stable. It isn't as subject, it won't fade under stress in heat as badly as some other ink will. So we're blessed that it was in that kind of ink material. There are over 900 different documents, 100,000 fragments, but 900, I think the latest count was 931, but with these newest discoveries now, that number would probably increase a little bit. More than 200 of them are directly related to the Bible or the material that we have in the Bible, but that means that there are 700 that are sectarian or not related directly to the Bible. But a lot of them are still religious in nature. Like the calendars, the calendars are giving evidence of when you should plant and when you should reap and all of those kinds of things, like an almanac, I guess, in some sense. They include parts from the books of the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible, all of them except Esther. Esther was one of those pieces that was highly debated early on as to whether it belonged in the Bible because there is no reference to God. It is simply a political situation in which Esther, who is the queen of the Assyrian, Queen Esther, as we know, and she is befriending her people and relations, but finally ended up being in there. They include the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, a lot of the Pseudepigrapha, I should say, not necessarily all of it, and previously unknown hymns, prayers. For that's what I mean when I say that most of the material has some religious significance or is religious related, even earlier versions of the Ten Commandments. So interesting in itself, isn't it? It helps us kind of rethink and study the material that we have that ends up being in the Bible. But there are some sectarian works, like the Manual of Discipleship. That's simply how you join the community and what you must do to remain in the community, how you must live, the rules you must live by, and so forth. The calendars I've already kind of referenced. The formulas, I'm really talking about mystical formulas. For example, remember about 3 weeks ago, I said within the Pseudepigrapha, or in the material between Malachi for you and Matthew in our Bible, in that material developed from 400 BCE to the time of Jesus, there's a lot of material that references demons and spirits, So it wasn't so foreign. It didn't just pop up in the New Testament. These were issues that people were dealing with for a long time. Well, these formulas are for casting spells or exorcisms, those kinds of things. They're that kind of thing in nature. So again, they're somewhat religious in nature. And then there's even some commentaries, like there is one for Habakkuk. Some of the jars, and I'm sorry, those really are they're a lot more brownish red than they're showing up in these projected images. So if you were seeing them off of my computer, they'd be a lot brighter and bolder in color. But still, these are the jars that were used to contain a lot of the material. This is the copper scroll. It was found in Cave 3 at Qumran. It's 8 feet long by a foot wide, approximately. This is how it looked when it was found. These are sections that have been preserved and encased in glass today to continue to keep them and preserve them. They are in the Jordan Archaeological Museum, so not in Jerusalem. And they look kind of silverish, even in the pictures that I had, even though you would think copper would look a little different, but it's aged a little bit. Here's a picture of some of the fragments, just to show you the small fragments. These are very small. They've just been blown up for this picture. This is part of the great Isaiah scroll I'm going to show you. I think there's another picture in here of it laid out for study toward the end of the presentation. And Isaiah is an important discovery. I'll talk about that again in just a moment. This is part of a psalm scroll. And again, you can see the tattered edges. Some of that happened during the time that they were in the jars, but a lot of it happened after the time that they were brought out of the jars, unfortunately, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. The temple scroll is the longest one. It's about 28 feet long. Pretty important find. And it talks a lot about, I'll talk a little bit more about it in just a moment, but it talks about the details related to the temple, so that's why it's called the temple scroll, even though it's not the temple that we read about in the Bible necessarily. So this is how this all was found. In 1946 and 1947, a group of Bedouin shepherds were taking care of their goats out in the Judean desert. You go, why in the world would they take them to the Judean desert? I have no clue. But I'm sure there are still people, the Bedouins still live and circulate through here, and that's clearly part of it. There they stumbled upon these caves at Qumran particularly, containing the scrolls. They didn't know that at the time. This is just a picture of a couple of members of the tribe. But this is one of the main players. This Muhammad al-Asi was one of the shepherds, and he was looking for a lost goat, okay? And so he came upon these caves and began to look for the goat in there when he heard the sound of the pottery. What he had done was thrown a rock up into the cave, and you go, okay, how does a goat climb up into that cave? Anybody in here ever raised goats? Okay, Jerry Black has. I'm not only an old goat, but I've raised goats. Okay, my dad had a stomach issue, and so he learned early on that treating the ulcers that he had, he could do that well by drinking goat's milk. It's a little richer than cow's milk. And it just had some healing qualities for my dad. So one of Jerry Black's chores was to milk the goat in the morning and milk the goat in the evening so that my dad would have the goat's milk along with other things, okay? Well, my first nanny that I can remember, I was about 10, 11 years old, gave birth to 4 kids. Now that's unusual. Usually it's 1 or 2. Okay, she gave birth to 4 kids, and all 4 were Billies. Made my dad extremely mad. He wanted another nanny goat. That's what he was trying to raise, was a couple of nanny goats to have on the farm. And they were all Billies in every sense of that phrase. All Billies, like boys are all boys, okay? These were all Billies. And as they grew, in just 2 or 3 months' time, my dad bought a new 1956 Chevy. Okay? And those had fenders, and they had a hood, and they had a cab. So the billy goats, these little billy goats, would jump up on that fenders, and then jump up on the cab, on the hood, and then get up all the way to the cab. And they ate all my mother's shrubs, and she was very unhappy. They were not welcomed guests. So let me tell you, goats can climb. They can get to places you and I would not expect them to get to, and I can validate that personally. So that's what happened. When he peered down into the opening to see what he had broken with his rock, he didn't scare the goat out. The goat wasn't there, but when he peered in and lowering himself down, he found these 10 jars. He took 3 of the manuscripts from those jars and sold them to an antiquities dealer. Made a little money, okay? Several months later, 4 more were sold, either by him or some of the other members of the tribe. But those 4 were quickly recovered in 1947. The discoveries happened in 46, and these were recovered in 1947, and that by the monastery in Jerusalem, the Syrian Orthodox monastery. And they now are in, again, the Shrine of the Book, which is a section of the Israel Museum. The other 3 were soon secured as well and by the Hebrew University, and I think today they are in the Israel Museum, during 6-day war. Now we're talking 10 years later, another individual was able to acquire the temple scroll. And that's the one I was talking about a while ago. I showed you the longest one, 28 feet long. Contains statutes of the king and matters of defense, rules of cleanliness and sacrificial issues, just as you would think about priestly language, if you wish, related to the temple. But the temple that is described is of dimensions that were never built, and it's in a presentation to Moses, not David, not Solomon, but predating both of those individuals back all the way to Moses, so 300 or 400 years before the actual temple is built. So a little different, but it was one of those finds. Some manuscripts are almost identical with the biblical material. Isaiah, for example. So that's why you hear the reference when the people are talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls to Isaiah, because it is almost exactly the translation, the Hebrew translation, or the Greek translation, rather, of what we find in our Bible today. But many of those were somewhat different in language and content. Even Exodus and Samuel, for example, seem to be very different from what we have in our Bible. So we'll talk about what that suggests. These differences may be due to the different developments in the Greek translation, which we've talked about several times already, the Septuagint, 267 BCE time frame or beyond, and because it took some years to finish that Greek translation. And they're different from both of the Tanakh and the Samaritan Bible, but probably again due to the differences in translation of the Bible from Hebrew into Greek, known as the Septuagint version. And this may suggest that the Tanakh was not really considered by the Jewish community as canonical. Remember, canonical means standard, the accepted standard for faith. So this may not have been considered canonical until the end of the 1st century CE, so 60 years after Jesus, but probably not. But it does suggest that there were differences in translations that were floating throughout the region. Probably the most important archaeological discovery of biblical materials in the modern era. I think that goes without saying, because they do affirm, remember, every piece of the Bible is referenced in those documents, even though there are some differences. They do affirm everything but Esther in the First Testament. Okay? So that's really an important discovery for us in one particular perspective. These manuscripts are at least 1,000 years older, as I said earlier, than anything we had before. That's significant. And they tell us a lot about an Orthodox Jewish community or sect that had taken up a monastic lifestyle, may have been Essenes, but we don't know that they were the Essenes. The Essenes were a monastic group of people in the 1st century. They are, as we will see, clearly Jewish, not Christian. They're just happening at the same time. They're there at the same time. None of these documents mentions Jesus or his disciples. So clearly we are talking about a Jewish community that has simply retreated from the activity of the city, the activities of the temple, and become somewhat monastic. They may have retreated to try and stay away from Roman authorities and any Roman authority rule. For whatever reason, they have isolated themselves. Yet they are contemporary with Jesus, and so they tell us a lot about the times. They tell us a lot about what was happening, at least with this particular group of people. And again, we tend to just, our thinking tends to be that, okay, God called Abraham, there was Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and so forth, and the lineage just goes real smoothly, and Israel is established, and we get the First Testament. Then we have this break, and Jesus comes along, and we have Paul after him, and we have the Second Testament. And it just all kind of flows with an even stream, as though there is one common faith. And it isn't. It's quite diverse. There are all of these groups within Judaism. We've already talked about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes. They may have belonged to the other two groups. They may not have. These scribes are a monastic group that have separated themselves from the others. Their book of discipline has a way of life that is quite different than we find anywhere else. So all this does is evidence for us that there were all of these, just like we have so much diversity today, as I've mentioned in previous lectures or presentations, all these diverse groups. And yet we get this remarkably consistent piece called the Bible for our faith journey in life. So pretty important discoveries along the way. Well, obviously they're so important that they need to be preserved, but that wasn't how things started out. It didn't respond the first time. They were removed from the caves, obviously. You saw how the first 7 pieces were removed, but all of them were eventually removed. And they were taken out of the very dry, stable environment. We're talking 1,300 feet below sea level, very, very dry. Okay? That's why they survived in the condition that they did, and because they were contained in these jars. But when they were removed from the jars, and then they were laid out on tables by the scholars who were going to study them, they began to tape them together with adhesive tapes, which ruined portions and are still being recovered today. I saw a video about 3 years ago on PBS about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it showed the meticulous work that they're using with little knives like you and I might use with a hobby kit, a hobby knife, and they are just trying to peel away carefully the adhesive tape so that they can put them, and then they're putting them in a different environment to preserve them. The Antiquities Authority in Israel has a very strict protocol now in how they are to be handled, and they are placed in a climate-controlled environment. They are protected by 1,200 glass plates today, held in, again, this shrine of the book, especially in Israel, the Israel Museum, all except, again, the Copper Scroll, which is in Jordan. And they are now being digitalized so they can preserve the copies. They're taking careful photos, spectral imaging of these pieces to preserve them today, and because they are that important to find. This is one of the climate-controlled vaults, subterranean, by the way. And that drawer contains some of the pieces under glass so that they are sealed and protected. This is the Isaiah scroll I talked about a little earlier, laid out and rolled out. That's part of it, at least. So these are important documents and an important discovery for us, again, because of the affirmation they give us to the Bible and to the biblical times. They give us more information about the context and the history. So questions? I'm not sure I know the answer to that. The question was, how did the Copper Scroll end up in Jordan? I don't know. I guess they simply acquired it. They were the ones who acquired it, and they kept it. Put it in their archaeological museum, which makes the most sense. But I really hadn't thought about that question. Good question. Well, thank you all very much for sitting through a lot of information. Again, my goal was to show you what a marvelous gift we have been given and how remarkably it was preserved. Even though it may not be 100% precise in the sense that God dictated this and that's the way it is, it's pretty accurate, and there's a lot of affirmation to that. We can put our faith and trust without question in this marvelous book we call the Bible. God bless you, and thank you for joining the journey. Next week, you get to go to your own individual classes, and I bless those teachers who are picking up from here. God bless. Thank you.